Head of Legal and Corporate Affairs in Microsoft Israel, and I'm very happy to be here and very thankful for the organizers of this conference for inviting me to moderate this important session that's dealing with corporate accountability for protecting human rights in cyberspace. We have a very distinguished panel with us, and each of them will present an angle of this issue for 15 minutes. If there's time for me, I might add a comment or two at the end of their speeches, and then we'll open it up for discussion and Q&As from you. I think the main idea that brings us all together here in this room is the fact that we live in a very interesting and a very, I would say, amazing time from a technology perspective, and the advancement, I would say exponential advancement that technology is making at this time, and the opportunities that it brings with it. At the same time, I think that all stakeholders that are part of this, including corporations, including governments, and definitely academia and NGOs and other stakeholders, are very worried and concerned about the challenges and the contradictions that this time brings with it. The questions for these leaders, our leaders, ourselves, the policymakers around the globe, is how do we harness the power of technology to actually fulfill the promise that technology brings with it, and to improve lives of people around the world, unleashing that potential for dislocation or disorder. I think the task is daunting, and it's a very complicated issue, but definitely the leadership of everyone sitting in this room and the thought about the policy considerations that should be taken into consideration, and the laws that should be put in place, and the self-regulations that should lead our activities, our development of this technology, are at the profound of what each and every one of us does. So we'll have different angles to look at this from the technology perspective, and then we'll have a deep discussion on it. So let's start with our first speaker. I'm happy to invite John Garon, who is the Dean of Nova Southeastern University Shepard Broad College of Law. He's a nationally recognized authority on technology law and intellectual property, particularly in the terms in the fields of copyright law, entertainment, and information privacy. He served as Dean and Professor of Law in a number of universities prior to Nova Southern. He has numerous other accomplishments. Amongst others, he's an author of 4 books and numerous books, chapters, and articles, for which he's very well known of. I'm happy to invite him to speak. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me to participate. The first day and a half has been really fascinating. I'm really happy to be a part of this program. I open with a couple of quotes that kind of frame the approach that I bring to these materials, although I love the comments from our welcome this morning. But I thought Edward Abbey's comment, "Growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell," kind of captures some of what's happened over the last 5 years in internet governance. In a presentation I'm giving for the ABA Cyberspace Committee in January, again going back to this morning's themes, that paper is entitled World War III Origins, because we've seen such a dramatic change in the attitude of what is going on the internet. And so the point of this talk is to focus on a very little bit about how we got here, with a bias towards a US perspective, and then to really look at some entirely non-legal strategies to improve the status quo. Right, so this particular project although I'm a lawyer, looks at market influences. Again, from our morning conversation, there really only are when you go to the public sphere, when you take a company and go from private equity to public market, there is only greed or war that is driving these innovations. And as you'll see, greed wins out in many, many of these areas. So here I start with the question, how did we end up with the internet that we have today? And again, particularly looking at US law, although I think we see this in Europe and the influence throughout much of the world. We start with this basic metaphor battle in the early 90s as the United States Congress and other legislative bodies around the world were trying to figure out where to go with the internet. The ISPs and the telcos were really focusing on trying to get the world to think about the internet as an extension of the telephone. And we certainly wouldn't want the government to intervene with our private telephone conversations. And so the notion was no regulation is the right regulation, as opposed to the pervasive model of regulation of broadcast media, which was strong in the US and stronger still everywhere else in the world. And from that metaphor became the structural difference of what we did with the internet. Now, going back a couple of years, in 1974, the United States adopted the Privacy Act. In 1975, the EU began with its legislation on privacy. And quite frankly, had the United States fixed one small piece of the Privacy Act, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. The Privacy Act of '74 was a brilliant piece of legislation. Unfortunately, it only applied to US government databases. It became the basis of many additional pieces of legislation throughout the EU and eventually throughout the world. But because it was not extended within the United States, it left the United States regulatory regime without a model that started with privacy, reliability, verification, and the attributes of privacy that we have come to know. Instead, we have an era with relatively little regulatory policy in the United States. We have the changes in the technology, the hobbyists of the 80s, the early development of the technology. 91, we have HTML coming along, and the explosive growth of what is the modern web based on the graphical user interface in the early 90s that led to the explosion of commercialization on the internet. By 95, 25 million users were on the internet, and the US government decided to begin to regulate. And what we had was, from basically '86 to 2016, a 30-year love fest between US industry and US government. And so there was tremendous capture by the government, by the corporate entities. And so the policies tended to upend traditional notions of tort law in the United States and instead create a series of protections. The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is a fairly neutral piece of law, but in fact it is a very protective piece of legislation for corporations. Instead, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act from '96 stripped copyright holders of most of their rights, inverting the role of copyright as being an automatic right that was provided in the Berne Convention, and instead creating an obligation of the copyright holder for the first time in global history to police, to put all the onus on the copyright owner rather than on the publishers and republishers of content, inverting 200 years of copyright legislation in that one act. The Communications Decency Act went even further, and the Communications Decency Act, Section 230 of the CDA, created not a notice and takedown regime for invasions of privacy, for defamatory actions, but instead an absolute protection. Again, a very different regime than traditional booksellers, newspapers, other publishers have, and that protection, that immunity, created the modern situation that we have today. One other change is also worth noting. And again, I am a First Amendment scholar. I teach First Amendment. I believe very strongly in free speech. But if you look at US law, this is an article that I'll be working on as my third project, what you see is a First Amendment exceptionalism led by Justice Scalia that has, quite frankly, perverted the role of free expression in the United States to use it as a tool against the left in a very political way to create religious and speech freedoms so that they absurdly destroy other countervailing rights. They've destroyed largely the rights of privacy. They've interfered with employee-employer relations. Free speech has been used and free religion has been used to strip women of their reproductive rights, and on and on and on. You'll see in the middle here, there's a picture, of course, of a wedding cake with a husband and husband, because the US Supreme Court last week heard the discussion as to whether a baker can violate federal law by claiming that it is, in fact, artistic freedom to decorate a cake and therefore strip gay couples of their right to have accommodations from this vendor. Right? The Solicitor General of the United States has taken the side of the baker in this case. Right? So we have an absurd outcome to what has happened with the First Amendment. Animal snuff videos are protected by the First Amendment. Violence cannot in the United States be identified as obscene, even as to minors under the age of 13, because there is nothing that the court will find that isn't trumped by the free speech right. And that really has taken away the legislative process, and so that brings us back to why we have a non-legislative approach to this view. The other thing to bear in mind is free speech is only one of the rights. And this morning's panel, we highlighted the importance of privacy, right? So privacy is just as important a human right as speech is, association. There are a number of other rights that we need to take into account. In the US, unlike Europe and the rest of the world, it is speech and only speech that's at the point of these discussions. So given that our legislative track record is not particularly good, anybody who's read the newspaper knows that our Congress is not particularly good, we have to look at a non-legislative solution to improve the situation. And so instead, my theme is basically to think about a zoning metaphor for the internet. Again, in a properly zoned community, everything goes. There is a place for the nicest mall, and there is a place for all the strip clubs and bars in the world. Not suggesting that anything is taken down or removed, but instead merely suggesting that where most of us go most of the time look like the kind of place we want it to be, rather than being forced to walk through areas that we don't want to tread. In this case, being forced in the United States to walk through Russian propaganda about our elected officials, to walk through malware, to walk through purveyors of child pornography, to walk through corporate astroturfing, and on and on and on. Right? So if those are the harms that we want to stop, there is a series of steps that we can take that are non-legislative that create better places on the internet for us to engage. And I'll skip the astroturfing slide, but I do want to re-emphasize yet one more time, this is not an attack on free speech jurisprudence, right? And it's also a reminder that as frustrating as the internet is today, the battle over speech, the battle over rights, is not at its all-time worst, right? So these images, Brandenburg versus Ohio, which established the modern incitement rules in the United States, remind us of a time not that long ago where the stakes were vastly higher and the risks to society were that much greater. The middle picture is the House Un-American Activities Committee running a witch hunt through Hollywood, arresting and speechwriters, arresting film writers for refusing to testify as to their communist associations. Right? Things could get quite a bit worse, and we need to protect the First Amendment through self-restraint rather than through censorship. Or to look at George Carlin, if you remember the 7 dirty words. Right? If you don't like it, change the channel. And it's as simple as that. The best thing we can do about free speech is not empower the companies who are violating our free speech rights. The best thing we can do about privacy is not empowering the companies who are violating our privacy rights. So instead, we need to focus on the values that we hold dear, the values of democracy, human rights, copyright, workers' rights, and the like. So my focus is specifically on certain harms, such as protection from child pornography, unauthorized distribution of, unauthorized public distribution of pornography, some known in the United States as revenge porn, malware, defamation, astroturfing, unauthorized use of protected copyrighted works, source misidentification, and fraud. So the first step is to stop reliance on social media and search engines for the core of our content and return to a business model that relies on the portal system. Right? And there's plenty of market opportunity. Again, greed motivates. There's plenty of market opportunity for companies to promote portals. Yesterday we had a wonderful conversation talking about the importance of serendipity. And nothing like a portal can assure that 10, 15% of the feeds on that home page are coming from sources that the recipient didn't necessarily select. So there's a little bit of democratization of the news feeds of the information as well. So it can serve a second purpose. But the portals can provide a very important filtering role for the public, just as they did in the 90s before Google undermined the business model. Right? So the portals provide a moderated system. So companies who have their feeds into the portals agree to a best practices on the kind of content that they're providing. Companies who won't agree to this self-regulatory model will not be part of the core portal. Concerns about behavioral advertising, concerns about excessive use of data mining can be established through these best practices. You want to have access to my customers, you come along into the business model. Now, it's hard to sell the portal model alone, so we need a partner in this process. But we have a partner in this process, and those are our advertisers. Again, greed dominates. Google, Facebook, they're not content companies, right? And it's always a mistake to think of them as content providers. They are advertising platforms, pure and simple. That's where the revenue comes from, and that's how you control them. So the companies who are substantial advertisers are very protective of their relationship with their customers. As a result, companies like Procter & Gamble, Kellogg's, and the like are very, very sensitive to their customers feeling they've been betrayed. When Kellogg found itself advertising on Breitbart, a right-wing extremist content source, I won't say news, content source that somehow captured the presidency, Kellogg immediately pulled its advertising. Other companies have stopped using AdSense and other Google algorithms to place their advertising because they have found that 95% of it doesn't work anyway. That good ads are on good content surrounded by good consumers. And hand selecting where one places one's ads gets much more impact than allowing Google's ad algorithms to drive this market force. Google has sold its AdSense algorithm over and over again, and people flocked to it, but in fact it doesn't do the job. If you look at the consumer transactions, putting your advertisement next to things that make the consumer be interested, brand-to-brand high value creates much more power. The advertisers say we want companies, we will advertise on those sites that adhere to these best practice and standards, and you will dramatically change the marketplace And again, that is true in every commercial market around the world. The solution is not dependent on local norms because advertising is already normed for its territory, and so it works pretty efficiently. Third, we need to change the nature of the content that's getting through. So there are two ways to do that. The first is increased use of artificial intelligence and software to make sure that the best practices for these tools are being incorporated. These are coming much, much more effective than they were even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago. And so using things like clean speak, using the new perspective from Alphabet, there are tools that will look not just to bad words, but abusive content, abusive tone. And so again, now that tells the consumer, you can post anything you want. You want to flame your friends and enemies, go ahead, but you can't do it on this site. Because our site, if you're opting in, has a more respectful based communication. And I think the vast majority of people would prefer to be on a site that wasn't filled with hate speech, misogynist messages and the like. And so it can opt in. But more importantly, or equally importantly, we need to move back to the model that requires the same thing of our internet companies that we required of our brick and mortar companies. Right? Newspapers have to have their stories vetted. There is absolutely no economic reason since 1998 that we give a free pass to our social media companies, we give a free pass to our online services. Right? What we have done is we have allowed very, very high-value companies to have very few employees and then claim they can't staff up. We did not do that in the bookstore. We did not do that in the newspaper. We did not do that in broadcast media. And the public policy that allowed them to say, oh my, we can't do this, is just a lie given the revenues that these companies have today. We have seen, right, you saw my slide, the end of the 30 years love fest with these companies happened as a result of the 2016 US presidential election, and very serious congressional hearings have been held. Just like with the film industry, just like with other industries, congressional hearings tend to lead to self-reflection. Right? In the motion picture industry, that gave us the Hays Commission and the rating code. In video games, we have a rating system that's very aggressive and effective for the physical sale, at least, of video games. And so in the same way, we see that coming out of those congressional hearings, Facebook announced that it was hiring 1,000 individuals to manually filter. Google just announced it was hiring 10,000 people to start looking at its children videos because, in fact, the children's videos have been co-opted by pedophiles to put up hundreds and hundreds of hours of violent and abusive content aimed at children. And so this has really grabbed the attention of the regulators as well as Google, and they've announced a 10,000-person workforce to address this issue. And quite candidly, there really is no public value in adding 400 hours of content an hour on the Google book. I know we saw a lovely cat picture yesterday, but we really don't need any more cat videos, right? So it's time to start saying, okay, we want responsible, curated content, because that's really what the consumers want. All right, so you want your cat videos that are already there. Right, I'm not anti-cat videos. All right. So finally, one legislative piece that I would like to see is an amendment to the Communications Decency Act to bring the United States closer to European norms so that there is a way to take down invasions of privacy, defamatory material, going after the host of the content rather than having to find often the anonymous original poster of it. If we do those things, we are brought back to our central choice. Right? We have, on the entirety of the internet, nothing in this model suggests that anything need be taken down. but we have the choice as to whether we want to walk through the worst of 1970s New York or whether we want to walk through a lovely park that we have designed to our own choosing. Most of us, I think, would spend most of our time in the park, maybe the occasional Saturday night downtown. And that's really, I think, what we need to do with the internet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Garon. From my point of view, I can only agree that business models are an important part of a corporation's definition. It should. I'd say I do believe that any corporation must earn the trust of its consumers and its users. And the business model has to have limitations and constraints that sit on the values that we all adhere to. I think the practicalities, we have a long way to go, and we have to discuss this in more details. And this actually takes us directly to our next speaker. Dr. Onyeka Osuji is a reader in law at University of Essex School of Law, UK. He was formerly a senior lecturer and director of the Center for Commercial and Corporate Law School in University of Exeter in the UK. Dr. Osuji is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK, and his research interests include corporate social responsibility, corporate governance, consumer protection, globalization, and regulation. Dr. Onyeka, please join us.
Okay, thank you, conference organizers, for having me and for your wonderful hospitality. My presentation is within the theme of the role of non-state actors and corporations in shaping online enforcement. But my specific topic is about corporate social responsibility in cybersecurity enforcement. Essentially, what I'll be looking at is some of the points, or is about some of the points raised now, practicalities. We can talk about human rights, we can talk about all sorts of things, but in real life, companies sit in the middle of tussle between governments, users, advertisers, competitors, all with different demands. So how do you resolve those demands while respecting human rights? So I'm going to talk about one solution, which I hope will be seen as a solution. Okay, so what I'll be looking at is mainly with what I would call relational and solidarity signals. When we talk about the cyber world, we tend to see people as individuals, whereas one can also see people as groups, societies, sub-societies, shared nationalities, shared beliefs, including beliefs about absoluteness of privacy, absoluteness of freedom of speech. We share that. You can also have people who share beliefs about absoluteness of freedom to market anything. So how do you resolve that sort of situation? So that's what I'll be looking at. And my view is we can use corporate social responsibility in a smart way to do that. So in terms of background, in order to explain the scale of the problem, Andrew Parker, the head of the UK National Security Agency, speaking in October this year, was talking about the issue they are facing, how quickly the problem can arise, how shifting it is, and how they have little time to intervene in terms of security. At the same time, he also pointed out that companies should be seen as partners, and was talking about ethical responsibility of companies in order to resolve some of the dilemmas confronting cybersecurity. On another note, the UK Parliamentary Committee, in a session in May this year, also talked about the role of companies with regards to hate crime. Anyone from UK or knowing the British would know that when they speak, you wait for the statement that follows, but. Okay? So the Parliamentary Committee talked about what companies have been doing. You are doing a good job, but we want you to do a good job. So that is the issue. And talking about corporate responsibility in that position. So if you look at my slide, the Parliamentary Committee is talking about the need for companies to respond quickly. The need for companies to provide quality solutions. And if you look down on paragraph 49, and I think that's where I'm going to focus on, they need to recognize the human element, human judgment. So no matter the solutions being provided, companies are also expected to provide human solutions. At the European Union level, this human solution proposal approach has also been adopted, and essentially it is about companies being able to remove certain content as quickly as possible once notified. But the issue there is how willing are people to notify? And at the same time, notification is also about reactionary response, so not proactive response. So in the midst of all these things, the question is, what is the law? Essentially, the law in Europe and in the UK is still based on the traditional passive doctrine, which regards companies as more like the postal services. You haven't done anything wrong, you're just there, which a lot of us would criticize. I'm one of the people that would criticize such an approach. However, increasingly, because of users' activities, individual, private people taking action, especially in relation to revenge porn of recent, the courts are now recognizing that it is not really that passive. So they are recognizing that at some point, companies would have some legal responsibility. We don't know what the responsibility is, but the conclusion is that there is no legal responsibility to monitor and to regulate. That is the legal position in the UK and in the EU. The question then is, what can be done? Why can't governments regulate? Yes, governments can regulate, but we do know that governmental regulations are frowned upon. Sometimes maybe because, like Russia's government, collusion with certain activities that you find unethical. Then you have to look at the capacity of the government. Even when the government is doing what a lot of people would think as good, people would still find it as not legitimate, particularly because of human rights issues. So the reality is, companies face pressures to act. So they now act via what one would call corporate social responsibility. The idea that you are acting beyond your legal responsibility. So that is the traditional model of corporate social responsibility. But myself and a lot of other people have also seen corporate social responsibility as a method of governance that state and different jurisdictions can use corporate social responsibility despite its voluntary approach. The law can encourage it to protect the public interest. And I think that's the main point of my presentation. And let's take a pause. So in relation to the issue of relational and solidarity signals, what are the issues? When you have people who share certain beliefs or certain origins or other things that unite them together, what it means is that they have some attitude to regulations. And if you want to regulate them, you have to make sure they are part of the process. You have to make sure that you can try and influence their attitude towards regulation. And that's what I'm trying to suggest now. And my suggestion is based on sociological points. Some of them I've also made clear on that slide. And the key point there is how people behave as individuals is different from how they behave as part of a group. That is the key point. And in order to provide solutions, we have to recognize that point. And most times, people can easily shift to extreme positions when they are in groups rather than when they are individuals. So that's the concept of groupthink. Groupthink allows people to go to extreme positions, as well as making people to take extreme positions. The groupthink will enable the different groups to design their own secondary rules. So you can have your primary rules, the groups can design their own secondary rules, which will determine their motivation or their posture, their attitude towards the primary rules. So in other words, you still need the groups in order to function. And it is because of that that in 2015 I published a paper. I'm not going to bore you with the details. I proposed a model of regulation called inventive interventionism, which essentially is about using co-regulation via corporate social responsibility to address public governance challenges, public interest issues. The key points I want to identify there is use corporate social responsibility definition. So you can use the law to say your corporate social responsibility as a company should include so and so matters. The next point is stakeholder empowerment. This is now the focus of the next slides. Stakeholder empowerment. And what does that mean? It means how to get stakeholder users as groups, how to influence them in relation to how they see external regulation, how to use them to gain inside knowledge, because that is very important, particularly in cybersecurity, how to make them recognize legitimacy, and how to balance competing demands of human rights. And in my view, that can be done by recognizing the principle of collective responsibility in the cyber world. By collective responsibility, it means individuals and groups, members of groups, will have responsibilities set out clearly. And if there is any breach of responsibilities, the individuals, the groups can suffer sanctions, clearly indicated. And the benefit is about co-regulation. The benefit of the proposal is about co-regulation, in the sense that you as a primary regulator, whether the government or the company, you may not be in a position to know what exactly your regulation would mean. So let's say, for example, take the example of hate speech. And we don't want hate speech. But what is actually hate speech can differ from groups to groups. So what someone has posted in a different group, if you're not a part of that group, you may not be able to see it easily as hate speech. They may use slangs, they may use some of their coded language. How do you determine that if you are an external filter? So you need someone there to be able to say, this is hate speech. And if there is no collective responsibility in that situation, then an individual can say, I didn't do it. I didn't post it. Although I knew it was hate speech, I enjoyed the material, but I didn't do it. But if there is collective responsibility in that regard, such an individual will be prompted by reward, by sanctions, in order to say this is actually hate speech. This is what it means in this situation. So that's a simple explanation of the proposal. So it would enable individuals and groups to monitor content, to prevent certain content from coming in, and detect certain content to report them. Whereas, and in that situation, they will feel they are in control. So they will feel that is a more legitimate way of looking at the issues. I will just conclude with one case study which can bring this to light. And it happened in the UK. A WhatsApp group of students preparing for their A-levels, pre-university exam. So they belong to their WhatsApp group. So they discuss certain things. The exam regulator simply said, if you are a candidate for an exam and you are aware of cheating, you have to report to a teacher. And cheating, as defined by the examiner, was having unfair advantage. So you as an individual, you as a group, wherever you are, if you see any situation of unfair advantage, you have to know whether it is unfair advantage. You have to report. And if you don't report, sanctions. So that was the situation. And in one sociology exam, one of the students who was part of a group, because of timetabling clash, wrote his exam before the others. So he quickly, being a nice guy, posted the exam questions on their WhatsApp group. Most of the students there didn't do anything. Some reported. The exam regulator would not have known if people hadn't reported. So because some people knew about the rule about reporting unfair advantage, the rule about reporting cheating, they reported, some didn't. And those of them who didn't report were disqualified by the exam regulator from writing the exam again. The ones who reported were allowed to take a different exam. So looking at that situation, what you can find is that the primary rules were set by the exam regulator. Then the WhatsApp group performed the role of an informal institution, informal regulator. So it is a kind of co-regulation which is backed by reward and sanctions. I will end with this picture which indicates what it means. So in a group responsibility situation, this allows people to say, I did it or someone else did it. If no one talks, or if one person talks, the others didn't talk, there is that incentive to obey the rules. So that's where I'm going to end, and I'll be happy to respond to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these insights, Dr. Onyeka. From my perspective, I can only say that I agree that there's no one party that could do this alone. That's the first thing I say. The second is I think that regulation has proven to not stand with pace of technology development. And the third is that definitely CSR is a self-regulation tool, and it has to be, and where it's part of our role to play in this field. So no questions on that. And this takes us directly to our next speaker, Professor Michal Gal. Is professor and director of the Forum on Law and Markets and at the Faculty of Law, University of Haifa, Israel. She was a visiting professor at NYU, at Columbia, Georgetown, and other universities. Professor Gal is an author of several books, published scholarly articles, was chosen to be as one of the 10 most promising young legal scholars in Israel. I can continue. She won an award for Best Paper on Merger Policy, served on as consultant on several international organizations, and is a board member of some of international organizations. Please join us, Professor Gal.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's fun, to be reminded when I was chosen as one of the young, promising scholars, not young anymore. However, what I'm going to talk about today is algorithmic challenges to autonomous choice. And it has been said time and again today that we live in interesting times. And I want to focus especially on one development, one kind of technology in which the big 5 technology firms are currently investing a lot of money in order to be ahead of the race, and that is what we call algorithmic consumers, or you can call them digital butlers. And what are digital butlers? These are digital agents which are operated through algorithms which replace human choice. So while algorithms have been around for quite a long time and have assisted people in making many of their choices. Just think about Google search. So Google searches, of course, and algorithm. Think about TripAdvisor, which ranks hotels, for example. That's also an algorithm. So algorithms have been assisting consumers for a long time now, and they do an important job in many spheres of our lives. However, we are talking about the next generation. And here the next generation is one in which the algorithm not only offers us more information, but also might identify the need, execute the transaction for us. So let me focus a bit about this. This is based on a paper that Niva and I wrote and was published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. This is the basis of the analysis that I'm going to then move to with regard to autonomous choice. So what are we talking about? I mean, look at the consumer. The consumer can create stated preferences, say what he wants. However, the system can also learn from preferences, from his indirect actions, or it can gather information from other sources. And the information can also be collected and between different things. That's why we have the IoT here. For example, your fridge might tell an application that you're out of broccoli, and that so the fridge would send, or the algorithm would send an automatic message to buy the broccoli from the store. So the data is then collected, the data is analyzed, used correlations, predictions. Artificial intelligence is used in order to make a decision based on the information gathered and the what is available. And then the algorithm can execute the transaction. Everything here is automated. Just to give you a few examples, there are many more. One example is a washing machine that was created by Samsung together with a technology which is called Adapt by IBM, developed by IBM. This is a washing machine in which detects when your detergent levels are low. And when they are low, because of a sensor that sits below the detergent, what it automatically does is it sends a signal to an algorithm, and that algorithm then buys a new detergent for you using your credit card that you input that in the beginning. All you do is you get an SMS saying that a detergent was bought for you, and it will appear, it will arrive on that day. Add robots, okay? We are now in the age of robots. The robot might even then take the detergent from your doorstep and then put it near the machine to be used by the robot who would then operate your machine. So that's one example that already exists. Another example is an interesting application, a British one called Flipper, which automatically chooses your gas supplier for you on a daily basis. So it can flip from one provider to the other. And what it does is every day it checks who is the best gas provider, and then it buys, then it contracts with that gas provider for you, because the gas market in the UK is very competitive and switching costs are low. Okay, so you buy the application for 25 quid. If it does not save you the 25, then you get all your money back at the end of the year. They never had to pay that back. They always save you more. Okay, so these are just two examples of the technology that we're working on. So, and so, as you can see, this is not science fiction, and it's not even a big technological leap. In a way, it is a big psychological leap. So I think that it is time to ask whether we are willing to give up our autonomous choice, and what are the costs and benefits of having algorithms make some of the decisions for us in our personal sphere. Now, I'm going to relate to private people using the algorithms. There's, of course, I mean, the analysis would be quite different once I relate to firms. So right now, I'm only relating to private people. And I'm going to ask three questions here. We're going to focus on three different things. I'm going to focus on issues of efficiency, whether this is an efficient technology, makes efficient decisions for us. I'm going to focus on psychological effects, and then I will talk a bit about autonomy, reduction in autonomy. What does that mean from a liberal political theory point of view? So let me start with efficiency. So there are many good reasons to use algorithms to make the decisions for us. Algorithms can lower the cost of search, for example. And even if they don't lower, they lower not only the cost of search, but also the time it takes us. Because it might be that for us to look at 20 different websites would take much longer than it might take the algorithm. And even if it takes the algorithm longer, so what? We can do other things while the algorithm searches for a better option for us. So it can make a speedier decision. It can make a more sophisticated decision using, for example, deep learning, machine learning, using information from many other sources. For example, if the decision is a multi-factored one, it can then take many factors into account. For example, using the washing machine, the washing detergent, it's not only the cost, it might be who produces it, what is it made of, and other things that relate to choosing for us. It also takes less decisional energy, and there have been studies that have shown that each and every one of us has a finite decisional energy during a day. Okay, so it's like a battery if you want. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a committee. I've been in too many, probably. And as the day wears off, the first decision in on the agenda, everybody has a lot to say and whatever. When you get to the last one, wow, your energy levels are low. And if you're on the promotions, if this is a promotions case, you probably want to be the last in the day and not the first in the day. So anyway, if the algorithm makes some of the decisions for us, it lowers our need for decisional energy, and then we can use that for other things. And actually, one of the examples I like here is the example of Steve Jobs, who wore the exact same clothes for every day to work. Do you know what he wore? Jeans and a black. Exactly, exactly. And why? He was asked, why do you always wear the same clothes? He had them washed, don't worry. I mean, he had the same outfit, okay? Why did he wear the exact same clothes? He said, I am conserving my energy in order to make more important decisions. Okay, so in a way, this makes the point in a fun way. Algorithms can also overcome consumer biases. For example, if we go to the store and we see a packet which is red or has a smiling baby on it, we might react differently than to a bland packaging. The algorithm doesn't care unless we tell it to care, unless we decide that this is something we want to put in it. So the algorithm can make better decisions for us, at least with regard to some products and services. However, are there downsides? Of course there are. First is, of course, that the algorithm might make the wrong preferences. It might not understand what exactly we prefer. And one of the reasons for that is that algorithms are often based on what is called they're path dependent. They are based on what we already did in the past. So if I have always preferred mint ice cream, the algorithm might assume that I still like mint ice cream, although maybe today I would have a different preference. So this is one problem here. Another problem has to do with what I call the decision muscle. Because it might be that in order to make better decisions in other spheres of our lives, we need to exercise this decision-making power. So in a way, it's like a muscle, okay? You exercise it. So you exercise it on the small decisions, but then when you get to the large ones, you know how to balance the different things, okay? But if you let somebody else, the algorithm, make the small decisions for you, are you really going to know how to make the big decisions in life? So these are some of the considerations regarding efficiency. Let me talk a bit about psychological effects. Are these positive or not when we use algorithms? I mean, one thing that we can say here is that algorithms might make better fitting choices that might make us happier. And I think that Richard Ford put it in a wonderful way. He said, I am actually more free now because my true self, the self that labored under misconceptions, limited information, and emotional noise, is now facilitated by powerful and benevolent technology. So, in the way that Richard Ford sees it, or he puts it, he says, we are giving up our ability to go to a bad restaurant, to buy boring novels, to hear ear-splitting music, because the algorithm is going to make better choices for us, again, assuming that the algorithm can indeed make the choices better than we can. Are there negative effects to this kind of technology? Definitely, many. Let me just put a few. Let's burn some decisions. That's a positive one. Let me relate to that before. Here again, it means that this is a positive, meaning that we now have to make less choices, and sometimes choices can be very burdensome and can make people unhappy in their lives. And so transferring some of them, at least to algorithms, can have a positive psychological effect. But, okay? So one thing is social perceptions and interactions. Who am I when an algorithm makes choices for me? If you would have known that my clothes that I'm wearing today are chosen for me by an algorithm, and that the book that I read last night before I fell asleep was chosen by an algorithm, okay? And everything or many things that I did were chosen for me by an algorithm. Who am I to you? I mean, what kind of personality do I have? What am I signaling to you with the choices that I did not necessarily make? So this is one thing. Another thing is loss of social interactions. Part of social interactions is talking about the choices that we make. And I don't know if you've read the wonderful book by Noah Harari, who talks about why sharing information and even gossip is an important social function. And it's made humanity what it is today. And once you take this away, or at least take part of it away, that might be problematic. Another thing is knowing our world. And here again, I have this lovely example from the creator of Waze. Waze, for anybody who doesn't know, is an application, an Israeli creation, which is a socially based navigation system. Okay? Now, the creator of Waze said in one of the interviews that he asked his son to take him to the airport. And his son said, I cannot do that. And he said, why? And he said, because my phone is not working. So you can tell me how to get to the airport, but I would never know how to get back. Because he always uses Waze. So he doesn't know his way around. He doesn't know the world around him. Okay, so once we start allowing algorithms to make decisions for us, there are questions about whether we know our world. Let me say, I don't have much time, but I'm going to say a bit about reduction in autonomy. Here I'm going to relate a bit to liberal political theory, because in liberal political theory, the rationale is that the act of choosing in itself, not just having the ability or the freedom to choose or enjoying the objects of our choice, but the act of choosing is intrinsically valuable. It is part of what makes us the object of our choices, parts of what makes the object of our choices valuable to us. And it's our way of defining ourselves. Like Mills said, a person's own mode of laying out his existence is the best, not because it is the best in itself, but it is his own mode that he chose to apply. So, in a way, we have here a choice paradox. Why a choice paradox? Because I chose to employ the algorithm, right? I might choose the algorithm, or I might have an algorithm choose the algorithm for me to choose my products or whatever. However, I made the initial choice to employ some kind of algorithm, okay, to make the choices for me. So in a way, I have exercised my autonomy in this fashion. However, is this sufficient for us? To be autonomous people and to exercise our autonomy. So I'm going to skip this because of time limitations, because I go through in the article, this is based on an article which is coming out in the Michigan Journal of Law and Technology. And so I go through positive freedom, and I show that positive freedom is not so affected by algorithms, because in a way, the algorithm is the long arm of our preferences. I go through negative freedom, but what is important, what is more important, is the effect on the act of choosing itself and the autonomy itself. And so the question here is whether once we delegate this to an algorithm, is this going to be harmful for us? So it goes both ways. Let me just put some of the issues here on the table. One of them is, as I said before, is the decision muscle. And it's also the ability to learn from our own mistakes and those of others. If we are not aware of all the parameters that have led to the choice, because the algorithm might be a black box, how does that, that might affect our autonomy. Another problem is that to be autonomous, one must identify with one's choices and be loyal to them. And there's a question whether we would be committed and loyal to our choices once they are made by an algorithm. So while there are harms to autonomy here, I also think it's important not to overstate the case here, because autonomy is an important value, but it is one among others. And the deference to an algorithm might definitely be worth the price that we pay in reduction to autonomy. However, I would suggest some implications. For example, I think we should think about who should use this technology. For example, would you allow a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 10-year-old to make most of their decisions through an algorithm? Is it really different if a child uses it or an adult? How do we use it? So one suggestion here is a stop button. Okay, I would suggest that in every algorithm that makes choices for us, we would be able, or that the technology would need to include a stop button, so that at every node around up to the final decision, we can then stop the decision that is made on our part. So thank you, and here are the articles.
Thank you, Professor Gal, for this deep analysis. I'm so glad you finished with that message that it's not all good or not all evil, because I think that autonomy, when I look at AI, a lot of the times I look at people with disabilities, for example, and I look at AI, the opportunities and the autonomy that comes with AI to these kind of people that the world is immediately translating differently to them, for example. So I think the most important thing that we have to continue is what values do we instill in these technologies, as we started with. And this takes us to our last speaker. And I'm happy to invite Dr. Normo, is a PhD law candidate at the University of Haifa, conducting her research under the supervision of Professor Neva Elkin-Cohen. She's also a research fellow at the Center for Cyber Law and Policy, previously served as a research fellow at the Haifa Center of Law Technology. Please join us. Thank you.
Okay, so hi everyone. I too would like to thank the organizers for this fascinating, eye-opening conference, so thank you. I will be talking about social network sites and especially about their emergence as new arenas for crafting and allocating human rights. Now this task, the task of shaping, crafting, and allocating human rights, is traditionally associated with the state and tackled by it. The thing is that there are quite a few mechanisms that aim to restrain this immense power of the state and to ensure that it is realized in a manner that in accordance with human rights, whereas in the context of social network sites, these mechanisms are considerably limited. Now this leaves various rights of social network sites users unprotected and exposed to exploitation by these platforms and by other stakeholders. So this will be the theme of my talk today. I will start by describing these new arenas that are emerging, and I will then suggest that this phenomenon highlights a salient public character of social network sites that justifies the application of public law norms to them. I will continue by describing these norms and the benefits of applying them to social network sites in terms of the human rights of their users, and hopefully I will conclude with the channels of applying such norms. Okay, so the emergence of social network sites as new arenas for crafting human rights relies upon two dimensions. So the first dimension relates to the broad spectrum of rights of rights, which is subject to the influence of social network sites. And the other relates to the various practices of control that are being performed by social network sites, and that might impact this wide range of rights that we've just mentioned. And so starting with the first dimension, the rights which are being influenced by social network sites are extremely diverse and interestingly pertain to different categories of rights. They could be civil or political rights like freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, freedom of assembly or demonstration, or the right to vote and to be elected. Or they might be economic, social, or cultural rights like the right to culture, the right to education, the right to work, and various employees' rights like the right to strike. And so I will not have the time to elaborate on the manner in which social network sites influence every one of these rights, but that might be clarified through the next point that I will be covering, which relates to the origins of this extensive influence. And so this overarching influence of social network sites relates, of course, to the features and tools that these platforms choose to incorporate within their sites as features that enables private or public communication, features that enable creation of groups, scheduling events, etc. But the impact of these tools is significantly amplified by the powerful and vibrant social dynamics that occur throughout these sites and that provide the users with two types of resources. And so the first kind of resources is informational and the second is communal. So let me say a few words about the informational resources. Social network sites differ from other internet platforms in their ability to support relationships. And so this yields myriad of interpersonal interactions which occur throughout these sites every minute, all based on the exchange and generation of information, and that add up to create this immense trail of content. And how the social mechanism that stimulates this generation of information relies upon various factors as reciprocity, the nature of our weak and strong ties that we have in our network, and various other factors. But for now, I just want to emphasize that this massive amount of information that is produced serves a variety of rights. It is, of course, relevant to freedom of expression, but also to many other rights. The right to vote, for example, requires a full and complete picture regarding the candidates at hand and the social political issues that are on the agenda. And the same goes to many other rights. So let's move on to the communal resources. So the same social dynamics also afford the sentiments of belongingness, trust, and solidarity, which in turn encourage manifestations of mutual help and sometimes even civic engagement and collective action. And these manifestations and sentiments draw behaviors like colleague assisting each other and exchanging ideas in various professional groups, or citizens cooperating to organizing demonstrations or participating in online or offline assemblies, students tutoring each other, or employees trying to schedule strikes. Okay, so this is the first dimension of these emerging arenas. And so the second dimension relates to the various practices of control that are being carried out by these platforms and that might impact various rights. So I chose to focus on 8 groups of these practices. Each one of them influences this wide range of rights in a different manner, in a different volume. Together they create this very effective and sophisticated control over the rights of their users. So this control is increasingly relies upon automated, algorithmic, and artificial intelligence mechanisms. And so the capacity of these practices to influence such a wide range of rights is rooted in their nature as social intermediaries and inter alia in their ability to determine availability of the informational and communal resources that we've explored earlier. So let me try to demonstrate that by looking at surveillance. So massive surveillance might lead users to refrain from interacting with certain people or content that they might feel reluctant to share with others. And so this information might pertain their health situation, their economic situation, their political agenda, or some cultural, moral, or religious debate that they're interested in. And so this might prevent them enjoying the full scope of both information and social support that might be required to a full realization of their rights in these areas. Also, these behaviors add up, and so over time, if many people will hold themselves back from generating or exchanging certain information, the overall picture depicted might be distorted or incomplete, and that might undermine the ability of other users to realize their rights. Because just let me go through the other practices really briefly. Profiling for the sake of targeted ads and other uses of the site. Cooperation with governments. Well, government might request social network sites inter alia to share information or to restrict access to information. Cooperation with private actors might pertain shared databases and other forms of cooperation. Censorship might be carried out ex ante by preventing users to upload information real time, by stopping live videos, and ex post by removing existing context. Expulsion of users could be achieved by suspending accounts partially or entirely, or closing down groups. Interfering with content and users' choices could relate to directly or indirectly creating content, organizing content, and various forms of nudging, for example. And finally, security and reliability of information regards various behaviors, but inter alia, the recent foreign intervention in the American discourse. So when put together, these two dimensions create these new arenas in which users' rights are being shaped, crafted, and allocated. And this reflects the unique and somewhat holistic influence that these platforms have with regard to the rights of their users. And so I've mentioned earlier that this is traditionally a task of the state, maybe the most important task of the state. It is reflected in the social covenant and in the principles which considers the state as a fiduciary of the public, but I will not elaborate on that. Just want to I just want to stress that the resemblance of social network sites to the state in this instance, and the enormous responsibility which is involved in the task of crafting rights, justify the application of public law norms which usually apply to state actors, also to social network sites. And so what are these public norms? So we could look at them as a set of standards that strive to guide the discretion of the state and to promote human rights and the public interest. And so it is possible to view them as divided into two groups. Substantial fairness, which relates to the reasonability of decision-making processes held by the state, and procedural fairness, which focuses on due process and the overall suitability of various procedures and decency of various procedures held by the state. And so if those norms would be adopted in the context of social network site, they might come in handy with regard to all the practices of control that we've just explored, censorship, surveillance, etc. But of course, they have to be adopted in an adjusted manner, and while being mindful of the legitimate commercial interests of these of social network sites. So just to be a little bit more concrete, if those norms will apply to social network sites, so when taking decisions that might hinder human rights, for example, when a social network site cares to incorporate a new method of surveillance, then they should be expected, at least according to this interpretation, to identify the various considerations and the rights that are in stake, and to properly balance them, to avoid biased considerations or discriminative results, to make sure that their conduct meets proportionality requirements. And for example, this method of surveillance is suitable to achieve the specific objective that the social network sites desire to achieve, and that there isn't any other less offensive measure in this regard. They should also be transparent in this manner towards their users, and to reveal the scope of the method, its objective, and sometimes its initiator. And so on the procedural level, for example, if a user was sanctioned, say that her account was disabled, then she should be able to be informed about the specific provision that she had allegedly breached. And this is surprisingly is not the case in many cases. Users just that they do not know why their accounts were disabled in many cases. They have to be able to argue their claims, to appeal, to receive reasoned decisions, to have some sense of predictability, meaning that they know what is the procedure, who will be reviewing the material, will be a robot, a man, etc. And they also should be able to have some access to databases regarding previous procedures held by the social network sites previously. And so on the more general manner, applying such norms could foster accountability and human rights-oriented processes, and inter alia, doing that by promoting availability of information and communal resources. And it could enrich our legal toolkit with some flexible guidelines that are suitable to changes in times and circumstances, but not less importantly, posing these legal demands might clarify the ethical responsibility of these platforms and enable users to calibrate their expectations and to foster public oversight and engagement. So stop here. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
I want to thank all our four speakers for these insightful insights and fascinating inputs. I actually wanted to share with you some idea that we started working on as a company to drive forward an idea of driving a new digital Geneva Convention where all pillars, the tech industry, the governments in their surveillance practices, as well as an attribution organization, all have parts to play. I will be happy to share this, but I want at this stage to open the floor for questions. So please, this one here.
The question goes to Michal. Michal, you were speaking about algorithm and how algorithm are going to make decisions for us. But I believe you took the easy part. Because today when we're dealing with artificial intelligence, maybe when we're dealing with neural network or deep network, the problem is it doesn't work for us, but neither we nor the developer know anything about what the hell the algorithm is about. And you didn't touch it because if I use normal algorithm, I assume that somebody knows what he's doing and it gives me a recommendation. But today some of the most important things are done by algorithms that nobody understands and can get to crazy recommendation. I believe there's a book about it, the math destruction, M-A-T-H, the math destruction, that brings all kinds of anomalies that can get into this situation. My question is, are you working on it or can you comment on it? Because I believe it's an order of magnitude more complicated and eventually it will all land on your desk as a legal issue of billions of dollars of litigation. So if you can comment on it.
Sure. Thank you for the question. It is. I touched it briefly in the article. I am going to just touch it briefly. Artificial intelligence, the more sophisticated and complicated it becomes, the algorithm becomes more of a black box to us. And as you said, not only to us, it's to the developer as well. Does that mean that we're not that all the things that I put up and I talked about are necessarily going to change? Well, I would say that not necessarily. It's just a matter sometimes of taking it to an extreme, because in a way that technology can make even better decisions for us. So in a way, it even strengthens the efficiency consideration. Let's assume that the technology can then find a correlation that we do not understand, not a causality, but a correlation between our genes and future diseases. Okay, we don't understand why, but we do understand the outcome. This is a part of artificial intelligence. This is good for us. It's efficient. However, it might affect the other parts in a negative way. So the balance becomes more complicated. But it's definitely not a yes or a no answer. I think it's a question of spheres, of on which spheres do you apply it, on whom do you apply it, and who applies it. I didn't even touch, that's the other paper, the issue of market power and benevolence. That's a really big issue that becomes even bigger once you have a black box.
Let's gather a few questions, and so we have like 10 minutes. Can you move the mic between the three speakers, and we'll see who's the question addressed to. Yes.
This goes to Noah. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to understand, do you expect each and every company, like Microsoft, Facebook, etc., to form its own tribunal for dealing with all those claims coming from users and from states and companies dealing with the breach of the
You'd be better
procedures and
without the
laws?
microphone?
Leave the mic.
Yeah.
Try without the mic.
Yeah, try without the mic.
Okay, so I just wanted to understand if you expect all those companies such as Microsoft, Facebook, Google, whatever, to form tribunals to deal with the claims of users and states and whoever breaching privacy and other rights of individuals over or procedures of those sites and social networks.
Let's take the other two questions, or three, and please, we can hear you. Please.
Okay, so I have a few questions. The first one to Osuji. Yes. I really like the idea of seeing users as regulator, but you start up with corporate social responsibility, and you end up with user responsibility to report. So you put the burden on the user instead of the corporation. So I'm not sure I agree. Second, to Michal, it was really interesting, and I think that the edification of choice and autonomy and right and freedom is not like, it's a new thing, it's a new contrast, it's a new connection that began in the 20th century. So it's not like forever autonomy was about choice, it's a new thing and now it's developing. So we can understand autonomy and right and freedom in other kinds of understanding. So maybe we should, maybe we should not. But, and the last one for Noah, I think the problem with applying public norms on corporation is that those kind of norms are crafted to states and not to public entities like states and not to corporations. And if we are doing so, in the end, we can end up with mess. For example, proportionality. In proportionality, we take in the one hand public interest, and in the other hand human rights. And the both sides have public public importance. Either it's the public interest or human rights. But if you take in one hand the business interest and human rights and say, okay, we need to do proportionality, so you end up with a worse scenario. Because if it's in business interest, you can say as a state, or we can say as a public, oh, this kind of surveillance, we think it's a bad. We don't need to balance it with human rights. We can say, okay, just bad. When we have public interest, then we can do the proportionality. But while it's just business interest, we can say and come from regulation from above and say, okay, it's wrong.
And there was a last question in the back, yes. Or maybe two. Last two, okay? And then we'll let our panelists respond. Yes, please. Yes, please. You can't speak up?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, firstly. I think this was a great conversation, but we must proceed. So thank you very much, and we move towards our keynote. Thank you to all the speakers.
So maybe I'll be break now. I'm more of a shop before. We're on time because we started 15 minutes late.